thanks for coming. I'm Lily. We'll talk about some falsehoods about reality. I chose this topic. I can't remember why. And I've been kicking myself for it, but as we do, ooh. And then I did that. We can edit this out in post, right? Anyway, hi, I'm Lily. I am an information security engineer. I'm an ex-historian, I'm a synthesizer enthusiast, and I am a professionally anxious human. I like working at the edges of systems, because in my opinion, the most interesting things happen there. It's also where things tend to break down, and where you can find the things that break. And every time there is another cycle of move fast and break things in the security space, we see a lot of the broken things. You may have noticed that we are in a cycle like that right now. And that means I'm seeing a lot of the broken aspects of projects and products, and what a good portion of them stem from, in my view, is a belief held by someone central to that work that the information that feeds and drives their systems is real in some kind of objective way, that their thing is naturally going to handle the complexity of the real world with computers, because computers are very complicated, and reality is simple. The core issue here is that reality is not literally possible to capture objectively, but we need to represent reality to our computers in order to do our jobs. So phrases like, the map is not the territory, they're common, they're quotable because they come up so often in our work. And put simply, most of the work we do with computers has some kind of relationship to things happening in pieces of the world somewhere along the line. And in order to deal with that, we have to find a way to represent the world to the computer in order to make sense of it. So we have to make decisions to turn those things into data sets and models and abstract systems that can be used to stand in for the things that we want to talk about and help us represent them and make new observations and test hypotheses about whatever this thing is. The Falsehoods programmers believe in the title of this talk, Falsehoods programmers believe about reality. This is a long-running format for lists about things that seem simple to deal with on the surface, and they get more complicated the more that you dig into them. There are many excellent lists and talks as well about how hard it is to handle every single edge case for names and time and geography and gender and email addresses and phone numbers, and the list goes on. You can find a list of lists at that link. And this title was also sort of kind of a little bit clickbaity to get you here, because I suspect that a lot of you will know most of or parts of or some of all of this sort of stuff I'm going to talk about already. And if you haven't yet run into it, you will, the longer that you go on doing this kind of work. But this talk is not just for the people who are in this room or the people who are watching it online, live or in the future. It's also for the people who would never have chosen to watch this talk. It's to give all of you who did choose to watch this talk the more tools, all these tools that you can use to have these kinds of conversations with the people in your lives in both personal and professional capacities who have fallen into the idea that we can capture reality objectively. And they're going ahead and building things based on this premise. And because reality is slippery and brains are weird, sometimes the person who needs that reminder is you or me. We forget some of this in small ways all the time. So, although the map is not the territory was a phrase that was coined, it was a phrase that was coined in the 1930s, but it's only one expression of a very old observation. It's not by any means a new idea. There's been so much philosophy and literature and all kinds of other stuff about it that if I started to list it, we wouldn't be doing anything else for the rest of this time slot. I will have to gloss over things like semiotics, which I am just as disappointed about as you are. So here are some works you can dip into later if you feel like going further down this rabbit hole. Anyway, this map territory thing has become increasingly load-bearing as we have made things more complex, and as the pieces of the world that we're dealing with in our data get more and more nuanced. So back in the time of the ancient Greeks, they had started to tease out some of these ideas, but they were often the kinds of musings that you would get at parties from people who had ingested some really interesting stuff most of the time. By the time we got to the Industrial Revolution and humanity started to try making and organizing things in a common way at some kind of scale, these little reality maps became way more important because they were necessary for anything to be organized or consistent when you were doing anything at the scale of like larger than the number of people who could fit in a town hall at the one time. And by the time that we had gotten to the point of making computers about it, we had made things nice and complicated for ourselves. We'd invented the concept of middle managers, and our species was capable of screwing up a whole lot of things way faster. But in our current moment, we have dialed it up even further than even the ancient Greeks would ever have believed. We've taken perfectly good databases and we have given them anxiety. We have built large language models on the back of literally everything on the entire open web and quite a few things that aren't. We've developed algorithms that make decisions about people and what they will see, what they will hear as they go about their days, and we've based them on, mass analytics gathering and physical senses and where you bought lunch yesterday and who you went to school with. So we need to continue to make this observation, and especially now, because we are beyond big data and we're into the realm of sort of weekend at Bernie's-ing big data around to make decisions about the world and the people and the things in it. So there are terms like, digital twins and world models and ground truth. They get thrown around in so many places, and these terms have the effect of carrying on this idea that we are able to measure everything objectively and then probably make money from it. We've taken all of these maps from philosophy to industry to individually shaping the information that people receive on a daily basis, and this whole set of things is still not actually the territory, not even close. Like, just ask an LLM how many L's there are in surveillance capitalism, and then, ask it again if it's really sure. So let's talk about some of the thinking traps that we fall into every now and then. I've broken some of these fallacies up into a few statements that we can talk through, like any structure we put over reality. The points I want to make as we talk about each of these statements are going to overlap with each other a little bit, contradict each other in some places. But having worked on this talk for so long, I consider all of that to be kind of part of the fun that comes with the territory, so to speak. So here we go. Surely, the more data we have, the more perfectly we can represent reality. So to an extent, this is true. If you have one data source, you have one view of the world. If you have two, you have two views that allow you to approximate something more general about the world. And if you have 500 or 10 billion sources, then you probably end up with something that is increasingly nuanced, but it's still not reality. It's a bunch of different models of slices of reality with your interpretation of it laid over the top. Raw data as a term is an oxymoron. There's also a book with this title that goes into some of the examples about how this is so, why it is that way. All data is the result of someone's choices to measure something, how to measure it, what that measurement stands for, and so on. Raw data, I feel like, is more like raw milk. Like, it's unprocessed, unpasteurized, it's full of bugs. It needs some kind of processing to improve its quality and make it fit for consumption. There are plenty of things that cause problems with raw data, like interference and changing parameters and faulty sensors and faulty assumptions. Quality data sources are what really make the difference here. Things do tend to work better when you choose what you need for the purposes that you need it for, and you build your models and systems with that purpose in mind. In the era of scaling everything and relentless growth and line go up, it's almost a default assumption, I feel, that, some places will work with the view that quality can be coaxed out of a model later, and that the quantity of the sources is what matters the most. And to an extent, that works, but it is also very brittle. You have to work with your model and finesse it just right to get the thing that you want. Many of us are probably intimately familiar with how badly this goes when someone at your workplace decides to wire up 20 years of SharePoint to an LLM to finally solve the problem of nobody ever being able to find anything around here. And what's supposed to come out of that at the other end is insights. And what comes out is usually like an air horn noise. And to correct for it, we often end up having to write prompts that are so complex that it sounds like you're trying to outwit a genie by covering literally all the edge cases so it doesn't grant your wish in the most cursed way possible. So many talks about this conference have been about the issues that exists in all data sets and models, and particularly how Python helped them work with them. And this is a Python conference, so cool. So there's Ishrat Zaman's talk about counting the neurons in mouse brains. That was a really cool one. Renee Noble's talk about matching student names in a register to what the students write down when they sign in. and how even like multi-round approaches with a range of techniques and technologies couldn't match all of the names 100% correctly. And there was Dave Cole's talk about finding workable and realistic road trip routes for electric vehicles that accounted for all of the broken charges. The way that many AI product companies market and encourage users to think about large language models is, I think, a pretty big example of this fallacy. It's not really the fault of the LLMs. The technology itself is not something that should be about being a mirror of the world, but it is very tempting and very profitable to fall into the idea that it should be so, especially when you're told it's this general purpose everything machine. It's what I call the sparkle emoji effect. You put all of the LLM-backed features behind a little button with a sparkle emoji on it, and that encourages the idea that it's magic. And it's got a side dose of like, it's very complicated. Don't think about it. It'll just work. TM. And it's actually really important in deciding when to use an LLM appropriately that the users know the basics about what it actually does, which is mathematically predicting and outputting tokens based on the tokens that were input, and what it doesn't do, which is think and reason in some kind of like objective and neutral fashion, or at all. It feels to me like the root of this idea is like, check it out, we've scraped all of the data from the entire internet and all of human everything, and we are regurgitating it back to you. But that isn't actually everything. It's all written data that has been made available in a digital form, which favors the written languages and styles and topics that are used by the groups of people who have the most access and the earliest access to the internet and to publication technologies in all of the years gone by. That is like a small slice of perspectives when we're talking about the scale of humanity. But there's also a small slice of what language is. We've had written language for maybe 6,000 years, which is nothing compared to like the 100,000-ish years that we have had language in general, like as a species. Written language can seem like the most important thing today, but language itself is also gestures and tone and posture and facial expression and timing, and in an overwhelming number of cases, it is spoken and it is interactive. It assumes communities and societies and others at the other end. It is so bound up with our species that it has impacted the evolution of our hands and our faces and our larynxes and our limbs compared to other species. You should really check out Stephen Levinson's work on this. He's a linguist. He spent over 40 years researching the intersection of linguistics and evolutionary biology. It's really cool. Anyway, when we take just the internet accessible written parts of some languages and we turn it into a chatbot, and it is marketed like that is the basis of all like objective human knowledge and expression and everything, it really isn't. It is very good at natural language processing and like semantic search, and it can be made to be partially reliable, performing a subset of tasks if you hold it like that. And don't use too many run-on sentences or low resource languages, and maybe give it all the answers before you start. But it is not a perfect representation of reality. It is also not a therapist or a romantic partner or an intern. It can't even run a drive-through, because ingesting a bunch of training manuals on how to run a drive-through is not the same as having the experience of being a teenage human being who knows that the audio quality sucks and the people placing the orders at the other end are probably tired and distracted and occasionally likely to mess with you for like no good reason. It is hard to measure that experience in data. And yeah, this is another one of these fallacies about data that assumes everything is measurable when that is not at all true. How do you measure justice or security or love? These things are really important, but they are not measurable. You end up having to use things as proxies for other things. Sometimes we get so caught up in the proxy that we forget that it isn't actually measuring the thing itself. So, like speaking as a security person, the number of vulnerabilities that you patch in your app's code, it doesn't necessarily mean that your app is like more secure than it was before. It might still be perfectly possible for the app to be breached because a core developer's GitHub password was phished and the attackers can now control your build servers. It's all down to what we choose to observe or what we think we observe, because reality doesn't look the same to everyone. For a start, not all of us can see the same color spectrum. Not all of us have vision. We also have like opinions and histories that shape us and what we think is good and what isn't, and those views can change constantly. Some of you watching this talk probably disagree with me about what I'm saying or how I'm saying it. Some of you might be bored, and some of you might be fascinated or distracted by social media or by the ineffable nature of the universe, which is fair enough. But we often fall into this trap of thinking that there's only one reality experienced by everyone because it is more or less a defense mechanism. It's not actually good for our brains to be consistently aware of the subjective nature of reality for like every waking moment. There's an amount that it can be liberating to realize that a lot of nonsense like, I'm really bad at painting, that's a matter of perspective and taste and experience, but it makes it very hard to participate in wider functional systems with others, or like to buy groceries, or merge in traffic, or hold a conversation. We need consensus to get anything done on a cooperative level, so we approximate constantly, and this is usually mostly good enough. Take web standards. There is nothing to stop you from writing a web app that uses GET requests to make changes to the application state. Like, it's really not advisable to do that. But in my time as a penetration tester, I have seen so many apps that are built this way, and it works, but not all of the other systems make the same assumptions about how that's going to work, and it gets weird really fast. And this is all human understanding. That's how it works. We've decided that words in a language represent things and ideas, and mostly we share those understandings in order to communicate, for example. It's also the foundation of all science. So one paper, no matter how well-researched or thoroughly documented, is just an expression of one experience. But if we do enough experiments in enough ways, we gather enough perspectives over time, we put them together, we discuss them robustly and widely among a diverse community, and we constantly search for new input, we approach like scientific consensus, which tells us what is more likely to be happening in the world around us and is a pretty solid base to build additional things on top of. Being aware of shared consensus becomes important when we're in charge of making decisions and/or have the ability to influence decisions about how a slice of reality will be interpreted for a data set or a model or a system. Our roles as observers also mean that we become describers, and we bring our biases along, whether we are aware of it or not. We are biased in the very act of choosing what to observe. We then make choices about how to describe the world to our model or our data set, which will reflect our experiences and our education and our beliefs in some way or another. There is nothing too small that isn't subject to some kind of opinion. Anytime you change a column name at someone at work gets like mad about it. You've experienced this. There is no data set or model or system that is not biased. You cannot remove bias. You can only continually be open to more quality input and see it as like an evolving consensus over time. Which leads us to the issue of categorization. There was a really spicy lightning talk at the conference yesterday about like phylogenetic bracketing. Every terrestrial vertebrate is a fish. So is a hot dog a sandwich? No? Are Jaffa's dumplings? Good question. I can see some nodding heads about the hot dogs, and I've seen a lot of people shouting no as well, and you're all really confident. All of you. Is cereal a soup? Cool. Reality has like no inherent structure. Any structure that we put on reality is artificial and it's imposed. And these structures can be really helpful. Like you can decide what you want to choose on a menu, for example, or where you would find things in a supermarket, but they are still made up, and there will always be outliers and overlaps and gray areas and debates, and I'd be very happy to get into some debates later because those are fun. Categories, though, they're really powerful, and like all models, they carry the power to shape the world. And people use categories quite validly as shorthands for many things. As we said before, we have to sort of like delegate and trust each other and operate by some kind of consensus to get through life. But categories are arbitrary and sticky and political. And at their best, they are a way to understand something about the world. At their worst, they lead to oppressions and human rights abuses. And when people mistake them for objective truth, especially when people use it as a weapon to control the world and force it to fit that descriptor, it gets really bad. The anthropologist and political scientist James C. Scott wrote about this very extensively in his 1998 book, Seeing Like a State, which goes really deeply into how governments, companies, and other groups have attempted to impose categories on the world at scale. The goal, whether consciously or unconsciously expressed, is to make the world legible. I think it was Jordy Miller put it in his lightning talk yesterday, you alter reality to match the software. This makes a lot of things very easy to manage, much easier to manage, especially when it comes to deciding how to allocate resources or plan for the future at the scale of a country, how to ensure that everyone in that country has the best chance to receive basic medical care and an education, and how to react and respond effectively and efficiently to disasters. But it doesn't always necessarily improve things. In making the world legible to a government or to a computer, it flattens and erases local knowledge and complexity that was often doing really important work in the context where it came up. And it's often really hard to understand and measure outside of that context, so it gets discarded as unimportant or like annoying. Scott gives a lot of examples in his book, including one about scientific forestry in late 18th century Prussia and Saxony. There were these diverse old-growth forests in these areas. They've been used for centuries by the local communities, from everything from medicines to like animal fodder to building materials and food, like they were hunting grounds, the whole thing. But when the state's wood supply started to decline, the government decided to systematically replace the forests with like the ordered rows of single species timber plantations. I think it was like a Norway spruce. And the state could now read the forest from like tables in an office because they planted them specifically in those ways. They got rid of the old one. This also enabled them to predict things like yields and revenues with really precise calculations. And for about 80 years, this approach was extremely successful. These plantations produced like uniform, high-quality timber with unprecedented efficiency. But once the first lot of trees had been harvested and the second rotation had been established, it became really clear that these whole simplified forests were just collapsing. The second lot were not growing as well as the first lot did, because the complex ecological relationships between the local communities and the diversity of the plant and animal species in the old-growth forest had been sustaining the soil health and the nutrient cycling and pest resistance and all that sort of stuff. The new forests, especially that first one, had been living off what the old forests had built up over centuries. And once that inheritance ran out, timber yields crashed, the forests died. So what looked like irrelevant complexity to state planners was actually the foundation that made the whole system work. It's not just forests, though. When powerful groups create categories and when there are strong incentives to fit into those categories or serious disadvantages for standing out, people and places start to reshape themselves to match the description. There's a particular kind of aesthetic. It's industrial lighting and reclaimed wood and minimalist furniture. You know the one. It's probably a couple of monstera plants, the whole thing. It's coffee shops and Airbnbs and all of that, co-working spaces. The Verge journalist Kyle Chayka decided to call this airspace, and this was back in 2016 when it was already this thing. It's everywhere. Why? And he needed this name for this sort of homogenized interior design vibe because it had been popping up, in his view, all over the planet without any connection to local context. It looked the same in Barcelona as it did in New York, as it did in Istanbul, as it did in Shanghai, everywhere. He found that this aesthetic, once he started to dig into it, was pretty much down to platform-based algorithmic trends. These kind of spaces photograph really well for Instagram, and they appeal to the demographic that uses these kinds of platforms, and they get recommended by the same apps that guide people to discover places to visit, and so more people made the things look like that so that they would also get favored. Spotify's genre categories work in a similar way for music. Spotify will commission and generate its own music specifically to fit the vibe of a particular playlist. But as the journalist Liz Pelly documented in her recent book, Mood Machine, the platform also uses their artist analytic dashboards, the ones that the artists themselves are using, to nudge the actual musicians to write and market their music to fit more closely into these categories, with the aim of increasing their chances of ending up on these playlists, which has become essential for any kind of visibility and therefore income on that platform. So if we make reality fit this, we get sort of like cultural equivalent of beige. This one is the main trap. It's not actually useful or desirable to do this. For one thing, we'll be here literally forever if we try, as I said earlier. Reality has no inherent structure. There's only the structures that we give it. This mindset also leads to overcapture of data, the indiscriminate inclusion of lower quality and extraneous data, bad decisions, inflexible systems, surveillance capitalism. For developers, This can also be really paralyzing. I've definitely started projects only to get completely hung up on trying to design a system that will gracefully handle as many of my potential future use cases as possible. And sometimes I get so stuck there that I never end up building anything. This doesn't mean that it is useless to make models. We just have to be aware that what we are doing is making a representation of the world for our specific purpose. And once you get there, that can be pretty liberating. Once I remember that this thing only has to work for my purpose right now, and I take the trouble to articulate what the purpose actually is, I am able to move more confidently. And I'm much less precious about changing things later if my current tools don't fit the job. So let's talk about abstractions. We'll get into some principles for how to use them mindfully and well. Abstractions are tools, not mirrors. Your tools are there to be useful, not perfect. As Bill Kent says, he wrote a book called Data and Reality. The second edition is the one you should really check out. It's 1978, I think, and it is very good. There is an important difference between truth and utility. We want things that are useful, at least in this business, otherwise we'd be philosophers and artists. We are only working with computers. We have a task to do with what we're coding, and if we don't, we should ask ourselves what we're doing. We need to leave the hard stuff to the artists. We should design with context and with purpose. Every abstraction should start with a clear sense of why you are building it and what you need it to do. Thinking in Systems by Dana Meadows is full of so many quotes that I could have put in many places in this talk, but I've restrained myself to this one. There are no separate systems. The world is a continuum. Where to draw a boundary around a system depends on the purpose of the discussion and the questions that we want to ask. This means being explicit about your constraints. What problem are you solving, for whom, under what conditions? What are you optimizing for? The same piece of reality might need completely different abstractions depending on whether you're trying to track inventory or understand user behavior or plan a budget. Design for your actual purpose, not for some imagined perfect system. And abstractions have consequences. This doesn't mean that we magically avoid the inherent issues with measuring the world. Just because we acknowledge that we're working with abstractions of reality, that doesn't mean that they don't have consequences. We've covered this off. The choices we make about what we measure and how we name it have an impact on the world. There are both technical decisions and also sometimes decisions that affect people's lives and opportunities and access to resources, which means we have to be thoughtful. We should ask when we're designing our tools, who benefits from this design? Who might be excluded or misrepresented? What behavior is this design likely to encourage? And sometimes the answer is, it's fine, we're just trying to track what laptops in our inventory need repairs. But sometimes it is bigger than that. So yeah, we're never going to be able to build perfect representations of reality. We're going to keep running into edge cases and categories that don't quite fit and data that tells us conflicting things about the world. And I am really here to say basically that that's okay. Once we stop aiming to capture reality completely, we can start building things that are useful. We can focus on solving problems instead of getting stuck in debates about whether a hot dog is a sandwich, unless that is your thing. I'm not here to judge. We can build abstractions that work well enough for their purposes, that acknowledge their limitations, that treat the people who have to live with them with respect. The map isn't the territory, but a decent map built mindfully and with a purpose can get you where you need to go. Thanks.